He said, "The group didn't arrive at the college until 11:30 p.m. for an 8 p.m. concert and didn't take the stage until 1 a.m. A minute into the first song, they blew out the power to their enormous sound system, but about 10 minutes later, it was all back to normal. They started playing again, but this time, they blew out not only the power in the gym, but the campus and most of the power in the neighborhood. You can also see the promotional flyer Green's little sister created for the show. This flyer would later be sold at Christie's auction in 2007. The last bit of proof is on Ozzy's own website, showing Glassboro as the first Sabbath concert on U.S. soil. Sabbath would play in 10 cities with over 18 shows for the next 5 weeks. According to one music critic, they blew headliner Rod Stewart and the Faces off the Fillmore East stage. According to Tony, when we went on, the crowd went absolutely mental. Then Rod Stewart came on and the crowd began throwing things at him. It was just incredible. And from then on, we became like the underground band in America. Originally, they were supposed to open for Alice Cooper at the infamous Whiskey A Go-Go Club in West Hollywood. But when Cooper canceled, Sabbath went from opener to headliner for their 5 dates with 2 shows a night. At the Fillmore West, they shared a 4-night stand with future Eagles guitarist Joe Walsh and his band, the James Gang. Iommi said, "We did the Fillmore West in San Francisco with them, and Joe Walsh was smoking this bloody angel dust. Right before the gig, Geezer said, 'I'll just have a puff of that.' Ozzy joined him. They thought they were just smoking a joint." But maybe the most significant name they played with was still relatively unknown at the time. That came on their last date before heading back to England when they played in Ashbury, New Jersey. Their opening act was the Steel Mill Band, featuring a young Bruce Springsteen. Overall, the exploratory tour was a huge success. Just as America loved Sabbath, so Sabbath loved America. Ozzy said, "It's every British band's dream to play the States. Coming from Birmingham, where the fucking sun never shines, it was magic to us." Before we move on, I'd like to call out one Black Sabbath rumor that is not entirely true, and even Tony Iommi got it wrong in his autobiography. Anton LaVey, the very real founder of the Church of Satan, never held a parade in honor of Black Sabbath. What did happen was there was a parade in San Francisco where the record company had a float promoting Black Sabbath. A man resembling Anton LaVey rode the float. But was it him? If you look at the video, it sure looks like LaVey, but there is no further evidence to back this up. LaVey doesn't mention it in his authorized biography and has been outspoken in his dislike of heavy rock music. All the video shows is a parade that included a single Black Sabbath float, paid for presumably by Warner Brothers. At the end of November 1970, the band returned to England and immediately started a mini tour of Europe from December 5th in Liverpool, England to December 19th in Paris at the Olympia Theatre. They would have 12 days to rest before starting to record their heaviest album. 1970 was a whirlwind of a year for Black Sabbath. They started the year as virtual unknowns, and by the end, they had released 2 iconic albums hated by critics but loved by fans. From this point forward, Sabbath would be known rightly as the fathers of heavy metal, even though they were all under 23 years old. 5 decades later, it's challenging to take in just how frantic the pace was for the most successful bands in the late 60s and early 70s. Whereas acts these days record an album every 3 or 4 years, Sabbath was peaking at a time when turning out 2 albums every 12 months or so was the norm. As a result, they were already thinking about their next record when their first US tour ended. As the band struggled to work around their frantic touring schedule, Master of Reality would be the first Sabbath LP that was recorded piecemeal rather than in a concentrated burst of activity. On the very first day of 1971, Black Sabbath entered the studio to start work on what would be one of the most influential heavy records of all time. The band went to Island Studios and worked with, for the last time, the same duo who pushed the sliders on the first two records, producer Roger Bain and engineer Tom Allom. Tom would end up being the future Judas Priest producer. In addition to having a bit more time in the studio, they also went from having a paltry 8 tracks to record on to a true multi-16 track recorder, which meant they could do more overdubs and experiment with their sounds. Amongst the handful of tracks recorded at this stage were After Forever and Into the Void, although the latter was still known at this point by its working title, Spanish Sid. Both songs were played during the band's brief UK tour in January and during their subsequent American jaunt, although Spanish Sid / Into the Void was still being lyrically refined. Arguably the most bizarre recording to be taped during that session at Island was something the band called Weevil Woman 71. Presumably a mocking reference to Evil Woman, the song they'd been forced to cover as their debut single. At the same time the band was going into the studio, their album Paranoid came out in the United States. When Paranoid was released in the UK on September 18, 1970, their debut album was selling so well in the US, 500,000 copies in the first month, Warner Brothers decided to delay the release of their second album. Paranoid would reach number 12 on the US charts and quickly go platinum. Then, on January 27th, they flew over 42 hours with multiple stops to arrive in Adelaide, Australia to headline at the Myponga Festival on January 31st. This would be the first time they played Down Under and the first time they would headline a multi-day music festival. Next, they had intended to play some dates in Japan, but were denied entry due to their spotty criminal records, Ozzy for burglary and Tony and Bill for marijuana. It was rumored they ran into the same problem again in April of 1972 when they attempted to revisit Japan. As it would turn out, Black Sabbath did not perform in Japan until November 1980, while Ronnie James Dio was in the band. With Japan out of the picture, they had a few extra days of R&R in Australia before another 40-hour trip to the Netherlands, where they played 2 dates on February 6th and 7th. At the time, Sabbath was still the Four Musketeers, ordinary lads from Aston who were all for one and one for all, and the band was the #1 priority. Despite their jet lag and without stopping to catch their breath, they flew from Amsterdam to England and traveled straight to the studios in London to resume work on their next album. But time in the studio would again be cut short. It was time to fly back to the US and officially tour for the Paranoid album. Unlike the US tour just 2 months ago, this time they would headline most dates, the exception being Grand Funk Railroad and mountain gigs. Now they would be playing in front of 1,000 to 15,000 Black Sabbath fans nightly, sometimes playing 2 shows a night. On this North American trip, they would cross the border twice for the first time to play in Canada. Future mega bands like Fleetwood Mac and the Jay Giles Band opened. Only the year before, they were making £50 for playing the Banklands Youth Club. And only 6 months before that, at the same club, they announced their name change from Earth to Black Sabbath. On the second night of the tour, February 18th, they played an uncommon stop for most rock bands, Union Catholic High School in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. The student body contacted the band's booking agent, asking if Sabbath would play at their school. Tired of the usual dull bake sales and dances, the students at Union Catholic endeavored upon a novel approach to fundraising. It first started with the Who concert at the school in 1967, followed by other notable bands such as Chicago, Blood, Sweat and Tears, and Cream. Black Sabbath would be the last band to play there. One first-hand account said, as the concert started, Ozzy came out with his band from our left, then froze mid-stage. Facing him, right up front, were rows of seated priests and nuns in the audience. I still remember the puzzled look on his face. He then shrugged his shoulders and began. Apparently, the nuns and priests had commandeered the first 2 rows. The Marxist brother who was assigned to the student council took one look at Ozzy wearing a big cross and chain around his neck and turned to a member of the student body and said, "Finally, you booked a Christian band." No one had the heart to tell him the truth. The sold-out concert with an estimated 2,200 in attendance would gross over $8,803.50. That's over $60,000 in 2022 dollars. Black Sabbath would go down as the biggest revenue generator in all of Union Catholic High School's concert history. Sabbath's generosity to help raise money for charity was not a one-off. On the same tour a few weeks later, they would play another benefit show in Paramus, New Jersey. The St. Matthew's Episcopal Church Coffee House sponsored Sabbath on March 9th. Profits for the two shows went to work projects and inner-city missions. And local bands got to audition to open for the Brits. This is just one of the reasons Sabbath is considered a band for the people. The U.S. tour lasted from February 17th until April 4th, 1971, and when they returned to England around April 6th, the boys headed back into the studio for a quick couple of days before heading out on April 14th for a 10-day Scandinavian tour. Then, on April 26th, they ended the Paranoid tour triumphantly at the Royal Albert Hall, where just 4 months earlier, the hall had refused to let them play in fear of fan violence. At this show, they were awarded their gold records for Paranoid. Around this time, 21-year-old Ozzy found out that his then-girlfriend was pregnant with their first child. Ozzy had met Thelma Riley, also known as Thelma Mayfair, at the Rum Runner Bar in Birmingham. That's where Thelma worked part-time as a waitress when she wasn't teaching. After living together for a few months, Ozzy decided the proper thing to do was marry Thelma before the baby arrived. So in July 1971, Ozzy and Thelma got married quietly at the registry office. Some said that they were married on April 1st, but that could not have happened since Sabbath played a gig in Rochester, New York on that day. Months later, Ozzy would adopt Thelma's 5-year-old son, Elliot Kingsley, from a previous marriage. Among Thelma's various talents, she was a gifted seamstress and designed all of the stage outfits Ozzy wore on tour throughout the 70s. The following year, on January 20th, 1972, they would welcome Jessica Starshine Osbourne to the family. In 1975, Ozzy's second child with Thelma, Louis, was born.
Now I'm sorry for the things I've done.
Ozzy would later admit to being a horrible father and husband to his first family. Adultery, spousal abuse, animal cruelty, and child neglect. Ozzy said years later, "Thelma really suffered with me, and I really regret that. If there's one thing I wish for in my life, it's that I could take it all back. But of course you can never take violence back of any kind, and I'll take this to the grave with me." Ozzy and Thelma divorced in 1982, and in the same year, he married his manager, Sharon Arden, with whom he had been having an affair. There are various accounts of when Black Sabbath finished recording Master of Reality, but most reports point to the last week of May. As the band prepared for the studio, Ozzy warned the press that the new record was going to rock, telling one reporter that the third album was going to be the heaviest we've done. It's going to be heavier than before because that's what people want. I don't know whether Led Zeppelin made a big mistake or not with their third album, but personally, I think a lot of people were disillusioned. If we ever decide to go acoustic with the band, we would do it gradually. But at the moment, people want heavy music. The heavier the better. Tony Iommi said that musically, Master of Reality was a continuation of Paranoid. I think all would agree that with the exception of how they tuned their instruments, his statement is accurate. There are 3 songs on Master of Reality where they all turned their instruments down 3 semitones. These are Children of the Grave, Lord of this World, and Into the Void. Without getting too deep into musical jargon, this means they tuned their bass and guitars lower than most, if not all, musicians at the time. This created a uniquely rich, dark baritone that no one else had. In another interview, Tony stated it was all part of an experiment, tuning down together for a bigger, heavier sound. Back then, all the other bands had rhythm guitarists or keyboards, but we made do with guitar, bass guitar, and drums, so we tried to make them sound as fat as possible. Tuning down just seemed to give it more depth. I think I was the first one to do that. As far as we can tell, Tony is right. Not only was he the first one in popular music to tune down, but he also started a way of playing heavy music that continues to this very day. This tuning down approach helped create many music subgenres, including the grunge sound of the 90s, Gent, which is a subgenre of heavy metal characterized by low guitar tunings, stoner rock, doom metal, and many more. So not only was Master Reality a classic hard rock album, it was an album that influenced thousands of bands.